Yes, students. Now, today we shall see in this video about how the respiration is taking place in human beings. So, before that, respiratory system in human. As you can see here, the diagram. First, we have nasal cavity, then we have pharynx, larynx, and from there we can see trachea, then trachea to the lungs. This lungs contain bronchi. You can see bronchi here. Okay, two bronchi in the left and right lung. Then we have bronchioles. Now this bronchi is divided into bronchioles, and from the bronchioles we have alveoli. And below the lungs you can see a stretched membrane kind of structure called as diaphragm. Okay, here you can see in this diagram trachea. Okay, this is trachea, then bronchi, two bronchi, then bronchioles, they are divided into bronchioles, and bronchioles contain alveoli. Okay, so let's see how is the mechanism of breathing taking place. This is a very important part of the chapter. So in this mechanism of breathing, here you should know about the diagram and the process of inhalation and exhalation. So normally we take in air through our nostrils. When we inhale air, it passes through our nostrils into the nasal cavity. So when we inhale, it goes from the nasal cavity, okay, from the nostrils to the nasal cavity, which is there inside. Now from the nasal cavity, the air reaches our lungs through the windpipe. So lungs are present in the chest cavity. Here we have chest cavity. So lungs are present in the chest cavity, and this cavity is surrounded by the ribs on the side with the rib cage, so as to prevent lungs from any kind of damage. Then we have a large muscular sheet called as diaphragm, which forms the floor of the chest cavity. So below the chest cavity you have the diaphragm here. So nasal cavity, from here we will have trachea. Okay, the windpipe is there inside this trachea. Then it goes in the bronchi and then the bronchioles, and then we have diaphragm. So now this is a relaxed breathing which is taking place. So when we breathe in, what happens is we inhale oxygen inside, and what happens to the chest if you take in air, you'll see the chest is expansion is taking place in chest. So expansion of chest is taking place, and what happens to the diaphragm? As you are expanding, the diaphragm is moving up. Correct? Diaphragm is moving up and your abdomen expands. So it is expanding. Okay, so diaphragm is contracting here. Now when you breathe out, when you exhale air, the chest contracts, your body posture again, abdomen contracts, and the diaphragm, it relaxes. Okay, so when you go for breathing, inhalation, chest expansion, and diaphragm is also expanding. Expanding means it goes down. So if you see, it will increase the area, right? In expansion is taking place of the chest cavity, and the diaphragm is contracting. So here in the breathing out, you exhale out air, chest contracts, the chest cavity, that chest cavity is contraction is taking place. In diaphragm it is relaxing, so it pushes up. So like this it pushes up, so carbon dioxide is breathed out, and when it expands, okay, diaphragm moves down, chest cavity goes up, it increases the surface area, and it requires more oxygen. So this is the basic process of this basic mechanism of breathing in, that is inhalation, and breathing out, that is exhalation. So let's see. So the breathing mechanism involves the movement of the diaphragm and the rib cage. So there are two movements which is taking place during the breathing, that is diaphragm and rib cage. So there is a position changes occurring in the diaphragm and rib cage. Let's see what happens in inhalation or breathing in. So when we breathe air in or inhale, the two processes occurs together. That is, the muscles between the rib contracts, causing the rib cage to move upwards. So as you can see here, the rib cage is moving up and outward. So that's why your chest expands. While the diaphragm contracts and moves downwards. So what happens to the diaphragm? It moves down, it contracts and it moves down. Like this, if it is there, it contracts and it moves down like this. Okay, so it is moved down. So again the area. So this upward and downward movement of the rib cage and diaphragm respectively increases the surface in the chest cavity. So as it is going up, this is going down, it increases the space in the chest cavity and makes it larger. As a chest cavity becomes larger, it sucks air from outside the lungs and the lungs get filled up with air and it expands. So expansion is taking place during the breathing in. It increases the area, so more oxygen is required during the in the chest cavity. Next we have breathing out or exhalation. So when we breathe air out or exhale, the reverse process takes place. That is, the muscles of the ribs release, causing the rib cage to move down. So when we have to expel out, so when we have to expel it out, diaphragm will move up, chest will move down. So what will happen? Compression will occur. So with this compression, whatever carbon dioxide is there, it is expelled out. So this downward movement of the rib cage and the upward movement of the diaphragm decreases. As the contraction is taking place, it decreases the surface in our chest cavity and makes it smaller. So when the chest cavity becomes smaller, the air is pushed out of the lungs. Understood? So very important part again in inhalation. You're breathing in oxygen, my rib cage moving up, diaphragm moving down, surface area increasing. So as the more surface area is there, we can take more amount of oxygen inside. That is inhalation. Right? Then exhalation, when we are, you can notice your body also, your chest, your shoulders is moving down. So rib cage moves down, diaphragm moves up, the contraction is occurring and this reduces the surface area and it pushes the carbon dioxide out. Okay, so before going to the next part, let's watch a video on this.
Organ in our body that can float on water? Give it a shot. If your answer is that there is no organ in our body that can float on water, then you're probably wrong. Because we have the exception of lungs. Yes, surprisingly, the only organ in the human body that can float on water is the pair of lungs. And not only this, but there are many other interesting facts about lungs. Tell me one thing, is this organ that important? Why are lungs so widely studied? Well, lungs form the core of the respiratory system. And this system makes sure that we are alive. And how is that done? We've seen how aquatic animals carry out the vital gaseous exchange. Now it's time we have a look at the respiratory system in humans. This is how the complete respiratory system looks like. It begins from the nose here and ends at the alveoli in the lungs. Let us get introduced to each part in detail. First comes the upper respiratory tract. It consists of the nasal cavity, the pharynx and the larynx. Let's commence with studying the complete nasal cavity. If we zoom into the structure, we find that the nasal chamber looks somewhat like this. It mainly has 3 regions or parts. This is the part we're all familiar with, the nose. Any idea what the openings are called as? Yes, they're called as nostrils. The nostrils, also called as nares, are these openings. Just as the nasal chamber within commences, we have the first region called the vestibule. This region bears tiny hair-like structures which serve different purposes. Any guesses what functions the vestibule region will have? The region has a lining of mucus that helps trap any foreign particle which enters through the inhaled air. Also, the hair in this region expel the trapped particles out with rhythmic movement. So the vestibule region has all the arrangements to defend the bacteria or other harmful particles that may try entering the system with the inhaled air. The next region following this is the respiratory region. This region usually serves many different functions. Most importantly, it warms the air to get it to the normal body temperature. Then it moistens it to make it suitable for the body. And lastly, it helps send some air to the third nasal chamber and push the remaining air forward into the next part of the respiratory tract. Now, what do you think the third chamber would do with the air? Well, the name olfactory says it all. The region is responsible for the sense of smell. It contains highly sensitive cells which send the received signal to the brain and help in identifying the smell. Post the nasal chamber comes the next part called the pharynx. This is like a common connection between the respiratory and the digestive tract. And why do we say so? Well, as you can see here, this acts like a common passage between the nasal chamber on the top and the windpipe and the food pipe just lying below it. The pharynx is also further divided into three parts. The nasopharynx, which is the continuation with the nasal chamber. Oropharynx, the one that lies behind the oral cavity. This is the central region. And lastly, we have the laryngopharynx, which is the last region connecting to the next part, that is the larynx. What do you think is the pharynx important for? Well, apart from receiving food and air from the respective zones, the pharynx performs one of the most crucial tasks. Imagine what will happen even if a small amount of food enters the respiratory tract by mistake. Apart from the discomfort caused, it will be a serious concern. But how does the food know the way to the food pipe each and every time? How doesn't the food accidentally enter the windpipe? Well, that's taken care of by the pharynx. Do you notice a small flap here? This flap, named the epiglottis, falls over to cover the surface below when the food enters the system. As a result, the opening of the windpipe gets covered and the food strictly passes into the esophagus. The presence of the epiglottis makes the pharynx an extremely important part of the system. Now, next on the list is the larynx. The last part of the upper respiratory tract is also known as the voice box. Now, this name talks about its significance. Is this responsible for creating the voice that we have? Yes, the larynx is involved in the sound production. And how does it produce sound exactly? Well, the voice box has lateral folds, somewhat like this. Now imagine air to pass through these folds. When they're open, nothing really great can be noticed. But now, when they are closed and when air passes through them, then the folds vibrate. And this gives rise to sound. And that's how the sound is produced by the voice box. The larynx is just a small box-like structure, but in adults, it just protrudes slightly. It becomes more prominent in males after puberty. And this bulging structure in the throat is called the Adam's apple. Well, these three components make up the upper respiratory tract: the nasal cavity, the pharynx, and the larynx. Now let's have a glance at the parts of the lower respiratory tract in the next part.
So I hope the video was very clear. Now there is one more video, okay, the part 2.
The upper respiratory tract. This is where we concluded the previous part. Now it's time we have a look at the lower respiratory system. As the air passes down the larynx, it has to travel far, crossing many junctions in between. The first junction is the trachea. This is also called the windpipe. This is a slender muscular pipe that lies just below the larynx. It usually makes up the throat region and extends till the fifth thoracic vertebra. Post this, it gets divided into two branches. The trachea is surrounded by rings of cartilage. It is the hyaline cartilage that surrounds the windpipe, which gives both strength and flexibility to the tracheal muscles. If the structure is observed from the dorsal view, then the cartilage rings are found to be incomplete. That is, they are C-shaped and do not form a complete ring-like structure. This helps in easy contraction of the muscles when the food is passed down the esophagus, lying just behind the trachea. At the point where the trachea is about to terminate, it's the next junction that arrives. This is called the bronchus. As we can see here, bronchus acts like the entry point in the lungs. It gets divided into two branches called the right main bronchus and the left main bronchus. Which is the right and which is the left, by the way? Well, here we're referring to the structures with respect to the human body that has this system. In other words, if this individual is standing in front of you, then this is the right and this is the person's left side. Similarly here, this is the right and this is the left main bronchus. Getting back, the bronchi enter the respective lungs to get further divided into bronchioles. Now before we talk about the lungs and the surrounding protective case, let's continue with the bronchioles and their terminal structures. The bronchioles are these smaller root-like structures that are present inside the lungs. These ultimately lead to the bundles of these tiny sacs. Any idea what are these structures that appear like cluster of grapes? Well, these sacs form the basic units of the respiratory system. They are the actual sites of the gaseous exchange. That is, the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood occurs in the alveoli. One single ball like this one is called the alveolus. Any idea why these alveoli have these several spherical ball-like structures? Why isn't a single alveolus a complete ball? Well, many smaller balls help in increasing the surface area. Imagine this single ball. Suppose it has the surface area of x meters squared. Now if the same volume is occupied by 25 smaller balls, it's obvious that the surface area will increase by many folds. Similarly, here as well, the number of smaller structures make sure that the surface area increases and the maximum surface gets available for the gaseous exchange. If we zoom in to see a single alveoli, we find that the cluster is richly supplied with blood capillaries. A cross-sectional view of a single alveolus helps us understand that it's very thin and composed of a single-celled membrane. The extremely thin membrane helps in very easy exchange of gases between the alveolus and the RBCs flowing through the capillaries. The process of gas exchange occurs via diffusion. So oxygen that has come to this alveolus gets diffused across the membrane and is grabbed by the RBCs. Once this is done, the carbon dioxide also gets into the alveoli via diffusion. And this carbon dioxide travels back the complete tract to reach the nostrils and move out of the body. This is how the gaseous exchange occurs in each alveoli. Now that we know how the components of the respiratory system present inside the lungs work, let us focus on the lungs and the other remaining components of the lower respiratory tract. Let's learn them in the next part.
So, I hope everyone understood the process of breathing, inhalation and exhalation. In the next video, I will be just giving you brief about why smoking is injurious to health and what happens when we sneeze, why we feel hungry after physical activities, why we exhale out when we exhale out carbon dioxide, why we exhale it out, how much percentage of it we exhale and inhale. Then we have breathing in animals, in the other animals. This we shall cover in the next video. Okay.